Welcome to this session on XM development. We'll be covering tips, tricks, kind of best practices, go over some frequently asked questions, and then be covering Q&A at the end with any time that we have remaining. So hopefully we have some time there. So let me go ahead and kick things off with the first slide. So hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Klein. I'm a developer advocate here at Qualtrics, and I'm very passionate about empowering XM developers, which are yourselves, to customize and integrate with Qualtrics through our developer platform. And so today we'll be covering the following topics. So first, we'll be spending probably 15 or 20 minutes covering the actual best practices and tips and tricks of XM development. First, we'll go over general best practices, then we'll cover the public API side of things, and then go on to the extension SDK. So those will be the plugins that we talk about. So after that, we'll spend about 5 minutes going over some questions that you asked recently as part of when you registered for this webinar. There were some questions asked, so we'll cover those. We have answers to a few of them. There's a few that we'll be just talking about and be providing some insight as to how we're going to answer that later, because they were more in-depth questions, and I think they warrant a more in-depth answer than we can provide in this webinar. And so that'll be really helpful, I think, for all of you and for others going forward. And then with the remaining time, we would like to answer any questions you have. So please use the Q&A feature that's in Zoom. You can ask questions starting now throughout the webinar as we cover topics and as things come up. Please ask them. I have Hubert. He's my fellow teammate on our developer relations team, and he'll be trying to answer those questions as they come up. And if we have time at the end, we can cover some of them as well. So yeah, we'll be doing, so this presentation, we'll be creating a slide deck PDF out of it. So all the links that are in here and all the content will be made available to you afterwards. So don't feel like you need to take detailed notes or write everything down. It'll all be provided afterwards. And we'll also record this webinar. We're recording it right now, and we'll make it available for you to watch on our YouTube channel. So let's talk more about general XM development tips and tricks. So here are some overarching best practices or tips and tricks for you to know when you're doing XM development. And when we say XM development, that covers any way that you customize, integrate, or extend Qualtrics. So that includes our API, it includes our extension SDK. We'll cover that. Some of the other kind of historical or legacy ways to customize Qualtrics we're trying to move those into these newer and more supported ways, like the API and the extension SDK. So here are some just high level tips and tricks. I think the things to kind of be aware of that, some of them are ones you've probably heard before in terms of like the security side of things. On the development side, it's almost ready to announce now, but it's not quite there. But we have these essentially sandbox instances called developer brands. So you may be familiar with your Qualtrics brand, which is the Qualtrics XM platform UI and product. We have almost ready to launch, instances of these that are basically sandbox that are mapped to a single user. So you can spin these up, you spin one of these up that's associated with your developer account here, and use that to do API testing, to do extension SDK development and testing. So in that way, you can not have to use either a shared sandbox environment or your production environment. So that's really exciting. When that goes live, we will be sending out a newsletter informing you of that and giving you some instruction on how to use it. We actually have some content already, as you see linked here in the documentation, that covers it. But that's something that's really, I think, going to be valuable for all of you going forward to be able to use that to do your development and testing. So, and then the other thing I want to focus on here is just different ways to engage with us. We have a YouTube channel where we're posting more and more videos and content. We also have a XM community site inside of our developer corner kind of category of that. We asked you to join there, and you can crowdsource ideas or get answers to questions. We're starting to see that pick up more and more, so I think that'll be more useful going forward. So very excited about those things. All right, let's go talk about public API now. And so, yeah, I think some of the exciting things to focus on here would be, I think, yeah, basically checking out the docs. There's quite a bit of content there. There are some kind of getting started guides that kind of go through common scenarios where you can use those to understand, from A to Z, how to achieve a specific objective. So look at those. There's a things to know section. So with that link, that should help you find what other information that might be relevant. There's this new Postman collection feature that we just released, which essentially allows you to really quickly ramp up and explore and test the different endpoints that are available in our public API. So that makes it really easy, if you're familiar with Postman, to get up and going and to test things out. So and then, yeah, just from a security standpoint, OAuth 2 is recommended. That's not always possible, but where you can. And I think one of the biggest gotchas we've seen is when things don't, you don't get the 200 response code that you're looking for, right? When you make an API call into Qualtrics, and that could be for a variety of reasons, but recommend that you have a retry, logic and strategy in place so that you can probably in a linear fashion back off but keep on retrying automatically, so you don't have to manually go back and try to make those calls. And then the only caveat there is just with like idempotent, not an idempotent request, so like posts especially, just we don't want to create duplicate resources. So just be aware of those and careful with those. So definitely you can still retry. Just, once you get a 200 or a success back, then don't make another call. Break out of your retry logic. So those are some of the common gotchas and tips and tricks for the public API. Now let's go over to the extension SDK. So here we have quite, some of the similar topics as to the overall XM development best practices or tips and tricks. And the ones I wanted to focus on here are in the development side of things. When you're creating, extensions and plugins, we have a pre-release version system that you can use to then be able to iterate quickly without having to necessarily bump up your version. It's almost like, hey, I'm just testing things out. And then to go along with that, there's an XMT develop command where you can use that to do local development, and it does a lot of nice things for you in terms of building your code and getting it submitted. So that is very, very handy and nice and makes things a bit faster. So we have links there that we'll be sharing out later to the documentation for each of those. Yeah, I would say on the certification side, yeah, just make sure if you do want your extension to be made available in our marketplace, then you need to have it go through our certification process. And there are quite a few criteria that it needs to adhere to. And some of that's pretty simple and straightforward, and other ones require some effort on your side. So just be aware of that. And then we have some nice UI components, guidelines, and then instructions on how to create a better user experience. And so those are some of the overall tips and tricks. Let's go on to the specific plugins. So we have 8 plugin types listed here. And the top 4 that are somewhat highlighted in green are generally available. The next 2 are in an early access or preview phase. And then the bottom 2 are still in concept, and they're moving their way towards being made available on a preview or limited basis. So we're just going to cover the top 6, since that's where we have actual tips and tricks and more experience that we can employ into those areas, whereas the bottom 2 are just so nascent that it's not quite, we don't have enough content to cover those. So let's start with workflows, tasks, tips and tricks. So I think the 3 main points to focus on here as you look at the left-hand side, and a lot of these will be like content dense slides, because we want you to be able to use this presentation as a resource as you go through things. So the 3 main points to remember here are that if you do have a lot of either complex user inputs or multi-step user inputs in the UI, then we have like a wizard component that allows you to do multiple pages. So that's something that you should consider based on how your UI progresses. And then XM functions are our version of AWS Lambdas, and it gives you much more control over what happens on the back end of things when you create a workflows task. And so strongly recommend using that. And it also makes it easier for you to export valuable or interesting information from your task, so that downstream tasks can consume that and maybe do things. So, maybe send an email or do something else in Qualtrics. So that allows users much more freedom, and it gives them additional kind of features that they can use within your task. So, and the catalyst for workflows tasks are workflows events. So let's go there next and look at some of their tips and tricks. So workflows events, there's also 3 kind of tips here that I wanted to cover. And these are more just either limitations or things just to be aware of. Post, requests are accepted at only post and with JSON as the payload. So just be aware of that. And try not to cast your net too wide in terms of making an event that handles everything. So if you kind of over genericize it, then we've noticed that in some ways that can be less useful, but also you start to get a lot of noise. And so it may make it harder to have or connect the right task to it or you might have to have too many conditions to do to narrow it down to the right type of event. So, and then there's 2 ways that you can connect your event to an external system. There's a manual way and there's an automatic way. So whichever one works best for your use case, you can set that up. So let's move on from the workflows area into data visualizations, and we'll start with reporting widget plugins. So reporting widgets, they are probably a bit more complex, and because there's a lot of interesting things going on under the hood. And so some of the feedback and tips and tricks that we've come up with are to basically try to see them in action. And a great way of doing that is to look at the network tab and see the requests and responses come back and forth from your widget plugin to the underlying functionality. And so you can see how it's working. So, and then also playing around and exploring the typing definitions in the actual code can help you understand at a very detailed level what those interface contracts are like and what's expected. So, and then keeping within the kind of data visualization, let's talk about embed insights here. So embed insights essentially allow you to export or pull in a Qualtrics widget into a an external system, right? And have it be, there's like a 15-minute session that it's good that you can have it be kind of fresh for, and then you just have to refresh that on your own, which is mentioned here in the tips and tricks. So, but one of the things that we've noticed is when you get started, kind of go the path of least resistance from an authentication standpoint and start with simpler, API token approach. But then once you're ready to test it more thoroughly and you've got it working, then switch to the OAuth 2. And that way, there's some challenges that come along with that approach in terms of just, your system needs to be able to support that code grant flow within OAuth 2. And so that, don't want you to get stuck up on that when you're actually just trying to get it to work, but then it needs to be there for when you want to push it to production. So, and that concludes, the kind of plugins that are generally available. So let's talk now about the two that are in early access phase. We'll start with survey question. So survey question, there's some more tips and tricks here. The ones I wanted to focus on and highlight were ones that are current limitations that we have that we want to collect more signal on. So for example, making authenticated outbound API calls from the survey question, that's not something that's currently supported. So if that is of interest or a requirement for you and your use case, please let us know when you get the post-webinar feedback survey we send out to you. And then also the other, I think, limitation to call out here is when just knowing that the survey question is basically a standalone feature, and that it doesn't interact or affect other components or resources within the survey. So it can't talk to the other questions, or it can't derive information about the survey respondent. So that's a limitation that if that would block you or would be something that you would prefer not to have there, then let us know that as well in the survey we send out to you later. So questions are an essential part of surveys, and surveys in turn are a key component of our next plugin, XM Solutions. So this is a behemoth. This is a massive one. And so there are lots of things to know about this. Some of the more, I think, common ones to watch out for and be aware of are, this set of supported resources that you can include or create or reference within your solution. They're listed there on the top line. And then validation and testing, as you can see, are important pieces to it. And that's true across the board, but especially for solutions, because there's so much going on, and there can be many points of failure or it breaking. So hence the validating all the different branches that your solution could go based on user input. So, and then also having tests for your code and for the functionality. So that concludes our plugin tips and tricks section. So we've got about 9 minutes left. Let's transition into FAQs. These are ones that were submitted previously by you all as you signed up for this webinar, or ones that we've collected in the recent past. So first off, we'll cover, is there a sandbox that can be used during API development? This is a great question. And if you are the Qualtrics partner and you have a sandbox brand that's a shared one that you use with maybe other developers from your company, you can obviously use that. However, for customers, that hasn't been something that's been readily available. So with this new functionality or feature of the developer brands that I mentioned previously, like that is going to be, I think, a game changer for being able to have an isolated environment in which you can do API development or extension development or both. And so that'll be, I think, really helpful. So stay tuned for that one. And then most common API use cases. So I'm actually in the process of trying to find out more detailed information about this, but from a support standpoint, from what I've seen and what we've experienced, the three ones that are most common are listed here. These are just in terms of like functionality, what you're trying to do. It doesn't necessarily speak to the business use cases underlying them, but typically it's, yeah, exporting survey responses and then importing them into external systems. And then also going the other way and enriching our experience ID contacts with whether it's kind of profile metadata or touch point information. That's something we see quite a bit. And then also generating custom distribution links. So, that's when customers using Qualtrics to manage, to do this feedback collection, and they might have like contacts as well with us, but they actually want to send out the survey emails or text messages through a different platform or system and not ours. So that is a way they can programmatically do that, is through those distribution links. So yeah, there's also a common task section within the API documentation that covers those and some other scenarios that are kind of frequently asked about. So number 3, best practices when you are syncing data with various client systems. So this is a good one. And I think we could probably get into some of the more details of what specifically, like how much data, where it's going, how many client systems we're talking about. So you might change or provide more context for us to answer this question. But from a general perspective, syncing in bulk where possible, yeah, that is what we recommend. And then, yeah, having that be consistent, like whether it's like a daily schedule or some kind of cadence that's reliable that you can always expect it to happen at that time. And then, like mentioned earlier, adding retry logic to handle, some temporary issues or failures, most commonly like a rate limit. So if like the rate limit gets hit, that way you can still eventually, hopefully, as long as that rate limit, the threshold comes down or the amount of volume comes down, you can successfully make that API call. So, and that should be less of a problem when you're working in bulk than when you are doing it more one-off or transactional based. So yeah, be aware of that, especially if you're doing it, on a one-off basis. All right, so that's the first part of our FAQ, page 1. We're gonna go to page 2 here. Now this one, these are questions that are really good, and they're all really good questions. These ones, the answers are, I think, going to be more involved, more complex. And so I think my answer to each of these is that, yeah, we've, thank you for asking the questions. We'll work with you on maybe getting some more of the details out of the questions that you've asked, and then provide, and we want to do this for the other ones too, like where it's not documented already, but provide in the documentation, answers to these, whether that's, a simple Q&A or FAQ, or if it's more involved and it's actually like a guide that walks you through how to do this. So like if you give question 4 up there, there's quite a few things in there, and it's around us, the workflows tasks. So I think we'll want to create a guide around that for workflows tasks that takes you through and talk or shows you what to do in each of those situations. And then same thing for Q5, the question 5 there, the pipeline. And so that one, I think just getting some more data about what is being asked. But I wanted to make sure you all knew that we heard your questions, and we are, we've answered some of them. We're going to work on answering the rest of them and keep them coming for sure, because that helps drive kind of the content that we want to create, or helps give a signal about what kind of content to create. So when you're a new XM developer and you register onto our developer portal, you get an email that has this information. And so we'll also provide it as part of this presentation deck, but it's essentially like each of the plugins they looked at, some of the engagement channels, like you see the community right there. There's different ways you can engage with us that way. So just be aware of that. And that is how the code completes, everyone. Thank you for joining. yeah, that ends our session. And look for our feedback survey and some more information, like with the resources and link to it later within the next 24 hours. And yeah, let's go build XM.